God put together his plan of salvation for everyone, regardless of their backgrounds. And if you remember the last time I was here, we talked about needing to be mindful of how we treat one another in the kingdom. Because although we've obeyed the plan of salvation, we're not all exactly alike. We may not be from the same time, the same culture. Maybe a brother or sister might struggle daily with a sin that we wouldn't even think twice of trying. And through all of this, we're supposed to have the same genuine concern for one another, that we show no partiality. And if we're honest with ourselves, that's not always easy. The book of James warned the early churches about the sin of showing favoritism based on wealth. And today, we could just as easily be guilty of this. But let's not assume that wealth is the only reason why we might favor or neglect a brother or sister. Yes, brethren, how we feel about one's marital status can influence us to treat brethren poorly. I remember as a teenager running across a congregation's website, and they didn't meet too far from where I grew up. And the website had a section featuring the preachers that this church supported. And in the section, featured a short little summary of the preachers there. This one particular preacher that I knew personally, who has since passed, the website featured where he grew up, what he did before preaching, how long he's been preaching, how long he's been married, and how many children he has. And this preacher had 4 sons, and for the sake of anonymity and convenience, we're going to call them Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John. And the end of the summary stated this: all but John are married. Now, I'm sure there was no bad intent by this writing, but I just couldn't help but wonder, why did the writer single out John? Pun not really intended. It seemed that although John was a grown man by this point, there was this subtle thinking that he really wasn't quite a grown-up yet. His life wasn't really quite complete. This is just one of many examples I've seen in the Lord's Church of how we don't always treat singles with the kind of respect that we should. I put this lesson together in response to the many statements that I've heard from the pulpit, remarks that I've heard in Bible class, admittedly some of my own struggles with this, and along with what other single Christians have told me. So before we get into this, please understand, I didn't have one individual in mind when I put this together. This not some kind of vendetta, no. I think this is an overall culture problem in the Lord's Church that needs to be addressed. And, when we're talking about culture, we do recognize that there have been significant changes in American culture over the last several decades. And I think it's safe to say that not all of these changes have necessarily been for the better. But, that doesn't give us an excuse to be inconsiderate. Wasn't that all long ago when I heard a remark in a Bible study that to be a single Christian was unlawful. Now, we have to be really careful about labeling something a sin only because it doesn't match up with our personal values and what we're used to. It is in our nature, I realize, in many ways to compare the present with the past that we remember. But we also need to have an honest approach when we're studying these different generations. It is true that in 1957, more Americans married than ever before and younger than ever before. It wasn't long before marriage was soon viewed as the last transitional step into adulthood. Even though we're talking roughly 70 years later, that idea still holds in some places today. Understand that time in America was anything but normal. There was a lot of positive factors going during that time with the way that the job market was, the housing market. All of that played a role in raising the marriage rates overall. And there were many other positive factors too. It was not a perfect time by any means. Oh no. Sometimes we don't like to sometimes we don't like to admit that fact. But there were a lot of things positive during that time. Now, I wasn't around in 1957, but I do know this. there were no build-ups to special wedding episodes on popular TV shows back then. There were no reality shows like The Bachelor. There were no books like The Case for Marriage. Not when marriage seemed so secure in its place in society. I'm not from that time, though. I grew up in the 1990s and early 2000s, which I now realize was a time when a lot of evangelicals were really concerned about the direction that our country was going in. There were a lot of books like The Case for Marriage that were really popular in the Christian market. Um, it's quite interesting because in secular, we'd be quick to say that secular culture, doesn't value marriage. Well, and there may be a legit argument to that. But I think in some ways, you could almost argue that secular culture perhaps idolizes marriage. I can tell you that there were a lot of popular TV shows then that featured a lot of special wedding episodes. Looking back, I'm trying to remember the popular Disney films of my time, and even with the boy-friendly ones, usually ended with a wedding. And then, there is something to be said about what our culture values. Something else that happened when I was growing up was 9/11. I know we talked about in a Bible class here recently about when that happened and a bunch of flags started going up on front porches. Yeah, this didn't just happen on my street, as it's pretty evident. This was happening all over the States. And why do we do that? Well, obviously it was a pretty uncertain time, and I think it's safe to say we were scared. We clung on to this symbol of freedom. It brought us some comfort. And as the flags came down gradually, it wasn't because that we were less patriotic. We just became less fearful. We had adjusted to a new normal. And I bring this up because I suspect in the Lord's church today, we've kind of had a similar mindset toward marriage. We have seen marriage go under attack for some time now. We've seen the momentum of those identifying as LGBT happening. We know that divorce rates have been a problem in society for a long time. They are going down. Unfortunately, we are seeing, sadly, among older married couples, we're still seeing some considerable divorce percentages going on. We know that teen pregnancies, once a serious problem, they've gone down. Although it is estimated that roughly 27% of U.S. children will grow up with one parent. These aren't new discoveries. Most Christians are all too aware about that. And so I think it would be easy to cling on to this comfort of marriage, as if marriage alone is somehow going to restore morality, not just to the church, but to secular culture. But there's some flaws to this approach here. It's time to go ahead and hit the scriptures here. 1 Corinthians 7, beginning in verse 23. 1 Corinthians 7, starting in verse 23, where we read, "You were bought at a price. Do not become slaves of men. Brethren, let each one remain with God in that state which he was called. Now, concerning virgins, I have no commandment from the Lord, yet I give judgment as one whom the Lord in his mercy has made trustworthy. I suppose, therefore, that this is good because of the present distress, that it is good for man to remain as he is. Are you bound to a wife? Do not seek to be loosed. Are you loosed from a wife? Do not seek a wife. But even if you do marry, you have not sinned, and if a virgin marries, she has not sinned. Nevertheless, such will have trouble in the flesh, but I would spare you. But this I say, brethren, the time is short, so that from now on, even those who have wives should be as though they had none, those who weep as though they did not weep, those who rejoice as though they did not rejoice, those who buy as though they did not possess, and those who use this world as not misusing it. For the form of this world is passing away. But I want you to be without care. He who is unmarried cares for the things of the Lord, how he may please the Lord. But he who is married cares about the things of the world, how he may please his wife. There is a difference between a wife and a virgin. The unmarried woman cares about the things of the Lord, that she may be holy both in body and in spirit. But she who is married cares about the things of the world, how she may please her husband. And this I say for your own profit, not that I may put a leash on you, but for what is proper, and that you may serve the Lord without distraction. But if any man thinks that he is behaving improperly toward his virgin, if she's past the flower of youth, and thus it must be, let him do what he wishes. He does not sin, let them marry. Nevertheless, he who stands steadfast in his heart, having no necessity, but has power over his own will, and is so determined in his heart that he will keep his virgin, does well. So then, he who gives her in marriage does well, but he who does not give her in marriage does better. A wife is bound by law as long as her husband lives, but if her husband dies, she is at liberty to be married to whom she wishes, only in the Lord. But she is happier if she remains as she is, according to my judgment. And I think I have the Spirit. I also have the Spirit of God. So what do we see here? Did God say directly that marriage was a requirement? No. Paul, an apostle of God, even implies that staying single may be better for the Christian. Now, Paul is not saying that the best Christians are single. He's not saying that. Okay? And he's not saying that married Christians are more worldly either, for that matter. No. What he's saying is that there's benefits of being married, but perhaps more if single. One does not necessarily sin by marrying, but one might be better off single. But ultimately, in consideration of the fact that the world we live in is temporary, to simply be content in the state that we are called. When we understand that the world that we live in is temporal, perhaps we do well that, yes, marriage vows need to be taken seriously, but we also need to recognize that the results are nothing more than a relationship of flesh and blood that's ultimately dissolved at death. Matthew chapter 22, verse 30. In the resurrection, they neither marry nor are given in marriage, but are like angels in heaven. You might wonder why Paul gave this response to the church in Corinth. Perhaps the church at Corinth had asked Paul about this and they were looking for a direct answer. But the truth is that God doesn't always have a clear answer on some matters in the Scripture. And the trouble is that there have been a lot of attempts to answer questions that God hasn't answered, and we need to be careful about that. For example, it might be tempting to just dismiss this whole chapter of the Bible because we don't personally like the answer. And so we say, well, that was the first century, and the church was dealing with heavy persecution at the time, so today this chapter isn't very relevant. Really. First off, if it doesn't apply, why is it in the Bible? Would we have that same attitude towards stories like Nadab and Abihu, for example? Well, that's in the Old Testament. That doesn't really apply to us today. I think you know the answer to that. We also don't see Paul refuting his stance in any other letter he sent out to a congregation, regardless if it was under heavy persecution or not. And by the way, the phrase present distress that Paul mentions in 1 Corinthians 7 here, are we meaning to imply that there is no present distress in today's times? Again, I think you know the answer to that. There's other ways in which the Bible has been used to criticize singles, and not, whether it be just, well, that chapter isn't relevant today. There's other passages that we can really take out of context here, and I think we would do well to look at that. The first one, probably the most commonly misused one, is this. It is not good for man to be alone. But we have to realize that Genesis 2:18 wasn't about the first century church. It was about the first person. Adam truly had no one to talk to. Okay? Animals at best. God has since established his church with commands for us to help one another, bear each other's burdens, to truly be a family. In Matthew chapter 12, verses 46 through 50, we read, "While Jesus was still speaking to the people, behold, his mother and his brother stood outside, asking to speak to him. But he replied to the man who told him, 'Who is my mother and who are my brothers?' And stretching his hand out toward his disciples, he said, 'Here are my mother and my brothers, for whoever does the will of my Father in heaven is my brother and sister and mother.'" Yeah, you can quote that it's not good for man to be alone, but when you don't do your part in reaching out to be a brother or sister in Christ, you are in many ways ironically doing your part to make them feel alone. Here's another verse we kind of take out of context. "He who finds a wife finds a good thing," Proverbs 18:22. Now we know that Proverbs is generally a book about general truths. Okay? Did Samson find a good wife? Did Ahab find a good wife? I know some of you think, well, Ahab was a bad person to begin with. Well, yeah, Jezebel made him worse. Okay? I'm not going to deny that this verse is in the Bible. I think we should also not deny the fact that there are a lot of bad marriages that are recorded in the scriptures. I won't deny this verse is in the Bible, but I'm saying, as we should for any verse in the Bible, keep the context in mind. And this next verse, I really debated putting this up here, and yet I am amazed at how many seasoned Christians take this out of context. Really? Better to marry than to burn. Well, hold on now. 1 Corinthians, let's take a look at the context. Same chapter, verses 7, verse 6. "Now, as a concession, not a command, I say this: I wish that all were as I myself am. But each one has his own gift from God, one of one kind and one of another. To the unmarried and widows, I say that it is good for them to remain single as I am. But if they cannot exercise self-control, they should marry. For it is better to marry than to burn with passion." It is true. Some Christians probably should marry, and there's nothing wrong with that. But that does not mean, okay, that a Christian is incapable of self-control. And we're going to talk about this a little later. Again, keep the verse in this context here. Verse 9 here does not negate verse 8 or verse 1 of that same chapter. See, we really have to take into account of what all the scriptures say, not just the scriptures that we like to quote. And I know we'd be pretty quick to criticize a denominational believer for picking and choosing verses to emphasize, but if we're not careful, we can be guilty of this too. Okay? We've got to study all the scriptures here, and that goes really for any complex topic in the Bible. What we don't need to do is to try to simplify the Bible to the point that we're using it to shame one's marital status. That really isn't what the Bible was written for. Okay? Have singles in other ways been shamed in the church? Yes. You probably never imagined that this topic would be brought up in the pulpit. Okay? But in regards of people meeting one another, trying to set some people up here, okay, I think it's good that we should talk about this. Hope you understand. I'm not saying you can't introduce singles to one another, but you need to do so in consideration and not with the attitude, oh, I'm going to fix this person's problem here. Okay? There's got to be a right approach. And I understand that, brethren notice when people are talking to each other, okay, sitting by each other, whatever good intentions you have, be careful about not gossiping. Be mindful of not embarrassing anyone. This is really unfortunate, but this is especially true with children. As a middle school teacher, I deal with children who have to put up with classmates, sometimes even adults, who question them if they have a boyfriend or a girlfriend. And I know that looks kind of funny from a distance, okay? In reality, there's really nothing funny about that. When I was briefly part of a singles Facebook group, I was particularly surprised at how many 18 and 19-year-olds that were there. And they were all expressing how much pressure they were feeling about not being married yet. 18, 19, yeah. Now, I imagine some of that pressure was from among themselves internally. I understand that. But, I mean, I am sure, however, that there was pressure from other Christians. And if we're honest, for some Christians, the pressure to find someone, it does start really early. And I know we're very sensitive to the idea of, LGBT propaganda being taught at a young age, but we really do need to be mindful of what we're teaching our children because they don't need that kind of pressure. And frankly, neither do adults for that matter. So, in consideration of that, I think we do well to read 1 Corinthians, again, going back to 7, but this time verse 13, where we read, "If any woman has a husband who is an unbeliever, and he consents to live with her, she should not divorce him. For the unbelieving husband is made holy because of his wife, and the unbelieving wife is made holy because of her husband. Otherwise her children would be unclean, but as it is, they are holy. But if the unbelieving partner separates, let it be so. In such cases, the brother or sister is not enslaved. God has called you to peace. For how do you know, wife, whether you will save your husband? How do you know, husband, whether you will save your wife?" Why is it that God did not specifically say a Christian must marry a Christian? He didn't necessarily say that. Paul is not so much encouraging Christians to marry non-Christians. Does he permit it? Yes. And why does that happen? I think it's because our God understands that just because two individuals are Christians and roughly the same age, well, that doesn't automatically mean that they're compatible. And brethren, be careful about trying to set two people up who just don't match all that well. You are not God. You don't necessarily know who or what is best for that individual, regardless if you think you're doing this out of love. You need to know your place. Okay? I believe Romans 12 talks about the need to be renewing our minds. And that's not just something that we do once and we're done with. That's something that we've got to be practicing on a consistent basis. And why is that? Because I think, well, just one reason is that we can be guilty of, believing something that sounds spiritual, but it really isn't scriptural. The quote that I heard a lot and still do is this: just focus on God. Just focus on God, work on serving Him, then He will give you someone good. At 23, I might have believed that. At 33, there's some serious flaws to this argument here. First off, shouldn't we all be putting God first? I don't think this is a charge we're only going to put on our singles here. We should all be striving to put God first in our lives. Second, the concept implies that singles must not be spiritually mature, and that those married are. I don't think you have to look very far in society, if dare I say in a congregation, to realize that's not always true. Third, it implies that marriage is some kind of reward. Brethren, people are not prizes to be won. Marriage is not an award for being a good person. I think we know that, and yet when we tell a single, well, I just don't understand why you're not married, what are we telling them? Well, we're telling them, one, that we're not very content with the fact that they're single. Two, there must be something wrong with them. That's the wrong approach here. Okay? Singles do have a real potential for the Lord. I can tell you that not having responsibilities as of a husband and father has offered me some flexibility. I don't have a wife to potentially steer me away from God or hinder my service to Him. I know that on the duty roster at Laurel Canyon, I've been more easily able to cover for men at the last moment. And, I'm not necessarily saying that if I was married that I wouldn't be able to do that at all. I do imagine it would be a little difficult. I've been able to cover for men there. I've been able to preach in various congregations. And I'm thankful for that opportunity. Now, I'm not qualified as of now to be an elder or deacon. And you know what? I'm okay with that. when you read about how the Lord's church is made up of different members of a body, that while we're all parts of the same body, okay, we're not all alike. We have different skills and abilities, okay? And I think the scriptures make it pretty clear that not every man can serve as an elder or deacon, and not every man should. Does that mean that their work is somehow more important than that of single Christians? Does that mean that, you know, do I need to have that title to feel like I can be doing real work for the Lord? I hope that's not my approach. So, yeah, I'm okay with that. I can tell you this, okay? There are some legit struggles of being a single Christian. Though I can't say I have to daily deal with family responsibilities just after work responsibilities, I will tell you sometimes coming home after a tough day at work, having no one to talk to, yeah, sometimes that's a legit struggle. I can't necessarily rely on other people to take care of things, okay? All the house cleaning, grocery shopping, financial decisions, you name it, that's on me. And you know, that's a real struggle for anyone who's been recently widowed. And I think that's something that we need to keep in mind, you know, whenever someone's going through that adjustment. Now, I speak for singles in the church, whether never married, divorced, or widowed. We're not asking for pity. We frankly don't like it when other Christians say that they feel sorry for us, like we might toward a three-legged dog. No, that's not our situation here, okay? But there's the other extreme, too, that does need to be addressed, okay, is that, you know, we have potential, but we're not machines with no limits. And we're not here to pick up the slack for married Christians that don't want to do the real work. We do have responsibilities, and covering them alone can be difficult. Would we have the attitude that we'd be willing to help any brother or sister along with what they might be going through? You know, I think this is especially true among single parents in the church. Now, I'm no expert on this issue, but regardless of how anyone ends up a single parent, you don't bear their burdens by telling them, well, according to statistics, your kid is doomed. That really doesn't help them at all. You know, I recognize there are real benefits of growing up in a two-parent home, but when a Christian doesn't necessarily have other physical family members to help them, what could one hope for? I would hope the local congregation would take that role seriously. I think we need to recognize, too, that culture changes. Yes, culture can change for the worse, but not always, okay? If you study history, you'll quickly realize there's a lot of things that haven't changed much at all, okay? Times do change. Our Lord understands this. So before we throw our hands up in the air and act like the lowering marriage rates must spell doom for our future, maybe we do well to know that there's nothing new under the sun. We need to really be careful about creating false dilemmas. Okay, a decline in birth rates in America has happened before. Okay, and it's happened in many other places. God knows that, and God's in control of all of that. If we ever do return to an unusual time like the 50s, it's because God will allow it to be so. But we need to remember, the jobs have changed. Okay, the cost of living has changed. Housing is different. Childcare has changed a lot. Now, God's church will continue to stand. His word will continue to stand. But his church ought to take into account how times change. And a refusal to acknowledge change, that's a sure way of setting up conflict, especially with younger Christians. So I ask, those of you who are older Christians, please, watch what you say. It's difficult enough just trying to be a Christian and people outside the body wondering, why do they behave the way they do? That's enough of a challenge. Just for being brethren, your words and conduct have a deeper impact on one another. You don't need to be pushing Christians out to the margins of the family, whether it be because of a difference in wealth, whether it be a difference in ethnicity, or a difference in marital status, you name it. Okay? And I'm not saying that you can't have healthy boundaries, Okay? I can appreciate, for example, why a married brother or sister wouldn't want someone of the opposite gender, of roughly the same age alone with their spouse. Okay? Healthy boundaries are all right, but what you don't do is go to the extreme by just ignoring singles altogether and not welcoming them into your spiritual family. We talked about earlier how James talks about the sin of favoritism. And I know in the place of worship, we might be tempted to say something vague like, well, God loves everybody. God values everybody. So do we. But that statement doesn't mean as much when we see you congratulating a young married couple and then using a single's marital status as a punchline in conversations. Or when you talk to that same married couple as if they're fellow peers, and then you talk down to that single who's the same age. We notice that. We notice when, and there are extreme politicians on social media who say things like singles are selfish and a threat to society, and we see when you hit the like button, if not sharing it and defending it. We notice that. Are we really surprised that singles are leaving organized religion in droves? Let me tell you, that they will leave the Lord's church if they don't feel welcome. And they don't necessarily have to feel unwelcome. They just have to be treated as less important. I speak for myself and for other singles in the church. While we recognize that not everyone can necessarily understand the daily things that we have to live with, okay, we'd ask that you'd appreciate those circumstances for what they are, as opposed to not even acknowledging it or making light of it. I don't doubt raising children is important. I don't doubt that the family has been under attack in our country, but I think perhaps in our attempt to overcorrect that, we're neglecting our singles. Growing up, I'm starting to realize the church was very strong about preaching against the prosperity gospel. And for good reason. Do this thing and God's going to give you wealth. That's frankly a little too simple. All while we were preaching against that, I think some of us were guilty of embracing a prosperity marriage gospel. Here, just follow this simple formula and God's going to give you a long, happy, healthy marriage. I think deep down we all know that's not really realistic, but I speak for a lot of my generation. This is what we were taught. Not just in abstinence education in the public schools, but in the church. And so, consequently, we never did hear about celibacy being a good thing. I never once heard that it was a good thing from the pulpit, whether from any of the lectureships or gospel meetings that I went to. Do you see the problem? When you imply that young people really can't control their desires and that marriage is going to somehow be this magic bullet that's going to take care of all temptation, you're just setting them up for confusion. And by all means, I think you ought to teach Genesis 2, Proverbs 5, and the Song of Solomon. But those roughly 10 chapters of the Bible really make up a pretty small percentage of it. And I think we should, take note of that in realizing that, yes, God has addressed marital love in the scriptures, but he has ultimately a more important priority in mind for us. Sometimes, and I think just for marriage in general, we fall for this idea that just by being Christians, we somehow hover above common struggles. And, I can appreciate there are times when a conversation between a husband and a wife should just stay that way and not shared. But I appreciate those that have been honest with their struggles, as opposed to putting on a facade. Because you know what? We need to talk about how to resolve conflicts. We need to talk about, wise financial choices. We need to teach our young people about avoiding the pitfalls of abusive relationships. We need to be teaching about how not to just lean on our spouse for spiritual support, but have our own relationship with God. Christians can fall into bad marriages. And I think we need to be realistic in understanding that a happy marriage can end in an unexpected death. Even in our age of advanced healthcare, it happens. I think sometimes we're a little too quick to tell a single using scare tactics. Okay, questions like, well, who's going to take care of you when you're old? Do you really want to die alone? Well, if we're going to statistically speaking, half of us will. Someone in a marriage is going to have to die eventually if the Lord permits enough time. And that's not something we should shy away from. I can remember when a preacher stated how we shouldn't marvel when a couple makes it to their 50th anniversary because, well, that ought to be the norm in society. I don't know if it was ever the norm when you think about the many ways that a marriage could have ended over those 50 years. I don't even know how realistic that was prior to 1900. I no doubt that a couple that's been married that long and is still relatively happy about it has put some work in. And, if they make it to their 50th anniversary, yeah, we should congratulate them. But we should also recognize at the end of the day, it was because God allowed it. Any child of God ought to learn early that you don't necessarily always get what you want in life. And hopefully this last election was a reminder for us of that. What God chooses to do with our lives, what he believes is best, that is up to him. We have no business telling God what to do with our lives. The real work as a Christian doesn't start when you get married, or when you become a parent, or when you become a deacon, elder, or preacher, or the wife of such. The real work starts now, in the present, just simply doing the will of God. God is going to use me for what he sees is for the best. And if I've learned that if he doesn't have a spouse in mind for me, I'll accept that. And I know some would say, well, that's a negative attitude. Is it? I haven't found a verse in the Bible that guarantees me that. I read that God loves me, loves you, and he wants nothing more for us than to be in eternity with him. Not marriage, not a long, healthy, happy life. Nothing else gets close to that priority of spending eternity with him. And believe me when I tell you this, a few years ago, I had to learn that the hard way. Okay, regardless of the relationships that we may have here on earth as Christians, we need to recognize that it's Christ who ultimately completes us, not a so-called soulmate. Colossians chapter 2, verses 8 through 10. See to it that no one takes you captive by philosophy and empty deceit, according to human tradition, according to the elemental spirits of the world, and not according to Christ. For in him the whole fullness of deity dwells bodily, and you have been filled in him who is the head of all rule and authority. I really wonder sometimes if we really believe the words of some of the hymns that we sing. In Christ alone, my hope is found. Jesus, my only hope is you. Where could I go but to the Lord? There's no other friend on whom I can depend. Build your hopes on things like marriage? No, on things eternal. Do we really believe that? Do we really live by that? Do we, by our actions, create a culture welcoming for all Christians, regardless of their marital status? I hope we do. And I hope you realize there's likely serious work that needs to be done with that. Change in a congregation's culture isn't going to happen overnight. One lesson isn't going to change that. You're going to have to do some work too. It may require us, myself included, going out of our comfort zones, practicing some more humility, and a lot of prayer. Okay? And yet, we should always strive to be welcoming for our brothers and sisters, regardless of where they may be. You have to do your part. And the reality is that's true with obeying the gospel as well. If you're waiting for the right lesson, the one right lesson that's going to motivate you enough, you're going to have to do your part as well. This morning, if you're not a Christian, will you submit to God's plan of salvation? Or have you obeyed the plan, but you need the prayers of the congregation? Whatever your need is. Thank you for your attention. And if you're in need, won't you come forward this morning while together we stand and sing.